Failure is always painful, but what's cool about failure is you learn all the things not to do for next time. There's a lot of things that, I did while I was building my first company that in hindsight were a mistake. And these are more like nuanced stuff that I didn't really hear other people talk about in business books or blog posts, but still things that made a difference. And so in this video, I want to share some of these things with you, some of the more nuanced stuff that I hope will save you time and energy that I wasted on making these mistakes.
I've been brainstorming all morning what I want to say in this video. I've been writing them down on my phone one by one, and so far I have 10 things that I want to share with you. I hope you'll stick around till the end because I really do think that these mistakes kill time, and in a startup, you just do not have time. And so the less time that you can waste making silly mistakes like I did or that most entrepreneurs do, the more time you have to build a product and be successful. So I hope you'll stick around till the end, and let's just get started. The first mistake that I want to talk about is doing PR too early. And what I mean by that is, getting an article published in the media about you too early in the company's life cycle. In our case, we had a TechCrunch article get published about True Story after we raised a seed round. At the time, it was cool, right? We got all this media buzz. A bunch of people heard about us through that TechCrunch article. But in hindsight, I actually think this was a mistake, and it actually hurt us more than it helped us. There's two reasons why. One is, a company pivots a lot in the early days. So you're changing your product and you're iterating a lot. So if you get an article published about you at the seed stage, maybe even pre-product, then you're going to be stuck with that message in the public. Meanwhile, you may have pivoted into something else. And that's exactly what happened to us. We put something out, we learned that it didn't really work, so we pivoted. And it turned out that the article that was published on TechCrunch became outdated within a few months. And so doing PR too early could mean that you have a false image of the company out in the public rather than the right one. So I think it's actually better to probably wait until you reach like a major milestone, like, you actually launch the product and you have maybe 1 million users or something, and then you can do like a big PR push. The second reason why I think doing PR too early is bad is because you don't get to control the message. And I'm a huge believer of being able to control your message in the media. What I mean by that is journalists and media outlets, they have their own agenda or own biases for how they want to frame a company just to get like clicks and views, because that's what they're incentivized to do. But that might not be the best thing for the company, because they might write about your company in a way that gets clicks and views, but might not actually be beneficial to your company or might not even be accurate. In our case, that's exactly what happened, because they framed True Story in a way that was different than what we were actually building. And even the title of the blog post was somewhat misleading. Everyone thought we were doing X, but meanwhile we were doing Y. And so again, it comes back to this idea that doing PR too early can set the wrong tone and message for the company out in the real world. And there's definitely benefits to doing PR. I'm not saying there's no benefits. Sometimes people do PR because it helps bring in users, because a bunch of people hear about your company and then now they want to sign up for your application and then download it and so forth. And that's a good reason to do PR, but I'll kind of push back and say, if you're getting users by doing PR, then that's probably not a sustainable strategy. You want to be building more sustainable ways to acquire users. A PR thing is a one-time thing, so why would you rely on a one-time PR event to get users? So I don't really buy the argument that PR helps get users, because you should be thinking about more sustainable way to get users. And sometimes the second reason people do PR is because it helps them hire. So, a bunch of people hear about you, and so you might get engineers who are interested in your company. Or, if you're reaching out to engineers or designers or whoever you're trying to hire, the next thing they'll probably do is they'll Google your company. And if they Google it and they find the media article about you, it might create some positive perception of the company in their head. And that's definitely a good reason to do PR. And honestly, that's one of the reasons we did it. But I think that, in the end, it didn't really help us because at the end of the day, you're going to still have to convince them to join you for other reasons besides just the media article. And plus, like as an entrepreneur, you're successful if you can sell people on your vision and your dream and to join your company. So if you're relying on like a PR article to sell your potential future employees, I don't think that's a strong reason to do PR either. So all in all, like I just don't think doing PR too early helps companies. If in fact, I actually think it hurts them more than it helps them.
So, the thing I want you to take away from this is that before you do your first PR event, I want you to think long and hard about whether you want to do it then or whether you want to wait. Because once you do it, it's permanent. So, I'd recommend that you wait until you have your first major milestone, like your first million users or your first $1 million in revenue. So, with that, let's move on to the next point.
The second big mistake that I made was being in stealth mode. Honestly, that was so stupid. So, stealth mode basically means that you are keeping your company secretive until you decide to publicly launch your company. And it's just a giant waste of time because, a startup is all about experimentation. And so the sooner you can put your idea out there, the better because you get feedback and you can iterate on that feedback and you get to learn whether your idea has any merit. But if you keep your idea secret, then no one can give you feedback on it. And as many of you know, the idea has no value. The real value comes in whether you can execute on that idea, whether you can build a team around you and get users. And so keeping your idea secretive is just so silly because you're basically operating in a vacuum and not getting any feedback. Like at that stage, at that early of a stage, you should be dying for feedback. And so I spent like 2 or 3 months in stealth mode. And in hindsight, that was like a giant waste of time because I could have spent those 2 or 3 months getting feedback on my idea and actually iterating on it.
So, I think this one's pretty self explanatory. My recommendation to you is to just get out there early and get feedback. So, with that, let's move on to the next one.
All right, so number 3, picking a clever name. Don't do it. Don't pick a clever name. I made the mistake in the early days of picking a super clever name that no one understood. So, for those of you who don't know, True Story was actually not the first name of the company. The first name of the company was called Shelling. And Shelling is this really cool computer science concept. It basically means that if a bunch of people coordinate, they land at a convergent point called the Shelling point. And that's generally like the truth point. But like no one knew what it actually meant. Everyone thought they thought it was like seashells, like shelling like seashells. And I was like, no, like that's not what it means. And I kept explaining myself of why this is such a cool name and it has like this cool mathematical representation. Honestly, like no one cares. Just pick a name that is memorable and 2 or 3 syllables. If you look at all the big companies out there like Google or Facebook or Apple or TikTok or Snapchat, Instagram, Pinterest, like all of these have very memorable names and they're only 2 or 3 syllables. Don't pick like a super clever name that sounds like cool in your head, but no one's actually going to remember it.
So, the thing I want you to take away from this is not to have a name that's super complicated or super clever. Instead, pick a name that's 2 or 3 syllables, that's easy to spell and easy to say. And most importantly, make sure it's memorable. Because in the early days of a company, no one knows anything about you. The first thing they hear about you is your name. And so you want that name to be super memorable. Now, with that, I want to move on to the next point.
Number 4, being more like an artist instead of being more like a scientist. And what I mean by that is, okay, so I'm naturally a creative introvert. And so I think more like an artist in the sense that I love to create stuff and I like to like perfect it, all the little details. And so when I first started True Story, I thought of my company more like a piece of art, and I thought of the product more like a piece of art, where I was really trying to get everything perfect. But that is the absolute opposite of what you should be doing at a startup. In a startup, you should be acting like a scientist, where you're just running a bunch of experiments. Because that's all a startup is. A startup is a series of experiments that you run, and you run them really quickly, and then some of them work, and a lot of them don't work. And really, that's the only advantage that you have over bigger companies who have more resources and more cash. You have the ability to be really agile and run these experiments really quickly, and big companies don't because they're slowed down by their processes. So in the early days, I thought much more like an artist and a perfectionist instead of thinking more like a scientist. And that honestly killed like a few months of time because we didn't get to iterate as fast as we should have. And then one day, things suddenly changed in the company when we hired someone who had worked at a startup before and who had built his own startups, and he understood the importance of running experiments. And so he completely changed the engineering culture and basically the culture of the entire company by getting us to think in this way where we just move fast and run a bunch of experiments instead of trying to perfect something.
I can't reiterate this point enough times. I know a lot of engineer-minded or design-minded folks tend to over-perfect everything. Just don't do it, because all that time that you waste perfecting something is time that you waste potentially building your dream. So go out there and just put your stuff out there. Even if it's 70% done, that's good enough. Because if you try to perfect it, you're going to run out of cash and you're going to run out of time. So with that, let's move on to the next point.
So the next thing I wish I knew was not to hire people purely for their smarts. And look, I'm not trying to say that you should hire dumb people. Obviously, that's not what I'm trying to get at here. What I'm really trying to say is that, don't hire people just because of how smart they are. Because a person's intelligence doesn't get them that far. They need intelligence and more. In a startup, it's not about how smart you are, but about how much shit you can get done. And so you can have the most brilliant person in the world, but if that person can't get shit done in a fast way, then that person is probably useless for your startup. So this is a mistake I made and I learned the hard way because I ended up firing 2 people who were incredibly intelligent, but they just couldn't get stuff done. So I had to completely change the criteria for how I hire. And I learned the hard way that smartness matters this much, but everything else matters like way more. So my criteria now for hiring is, number 1, do they have the discipline and work ethic? Because again, a startup is all about getting stuff done. So they really need to be disciplined and have a work ethic. 2, do they have the ability and the desire to learn? Because a startup is basically like you taking a bunch of unknowns and then trying to experiment with them and seeing if any of them work. And so it's all about being able to dive into things that are completely new and figure it out from scratch. So you need people who are willing to do that, who want to roll up their sleeves and learn something new almost every single day. Other things I look for are, can they communicate well? Do they have attention to detail? I care about this a lot because if you have a high attention to detail, then you're very thoughtful with your work. And so I don't have to like double check or triple check your work. I can just trust that you'll get it done and get it done in like an efficient way. Other things are obviously things like, are they passionate about the product? Because, if a startup is like a lot of work and you commit a lot of time and you commit sometimes even your friends and family. And so you want people who are super passionate about your company and the product and willing to kind of make those sacrifices despite the fact that those are really important sacrifices. The final thing I look for now is culture fit. And everyone says this, like culture fit is the thing to look for, but no one really talks about how to look for culture fit. So the secret that I found to really assess culture fit was that we would do a 1-week work trial where we would invite the candidate over for 1 week and they'd get to work with us for a week, and we'd pay them for that week like a full-time salary. And you get to see a lot in a week that you don't really get to see in like a day long of interviews. And so that really helped us like weed out the culture fit question, because not only did we get to work with them, but we got to see them in their off hours, how they are during lunch and how they are after work. So it's a cool way to interview people rather than like the whole day long of interviews. So the take home message here is don't hire people just because they're smart, because smartness only gets you so far.
I know I keep saying this in this video, but again, genius is overrated. Don't hire just for intelligence. So with that, I wanted to move on to the next point, but just a little caveat that I decided to take a little break between this video and the next clip, and the break ended up lasting way longer than I expected. So you'll see that all of a sudden it looks dark outside instead of light outside. Anyways, let's carry on.
Lunch ended up being much more than lunch. I had a bunch of stuff come up. It's like 6 hours later, but I'm committed to finishing this video today. So let's get to the last couple points that I want to talk about. The next thing I wish I knew sooner was not to give your employees and team too much freedom. And what I mean by this is, in the early days of True Story, I thought that, employees would be the happiest if they had ultimate freedom. I thought like utopia was, mass freedom, and you get to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Because that's how I like to be managed, and I don't like to be told what to do. So I thought everyone was like me. But I was wrong, and it turns out that people actually want to be told what to do, and they want to have very specific and challenging and measurable goals. In fact, there's even studies to show that the more specific and the more challenging the goals are, the more productive and happier the employees are. So I learned the hard way that too much freedom can actually be a bad thing too. And that's not to say that you want to be micromanaging people, because that's bad too. You don't want to choke people by the throat, but you also don't want to let them loose completely. You want to kind of find that happy medium where you're setting weekly or bi-weekly goals that are specific and challenging. So you are, in some regards, telling them what to do, but this is important because it gives people a sense of clarity. It gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them a sense of accountability, that they're coming into work and they're doing something and they're accomplishing something. Without that sense of clarity and purpose and accountability, they feel kind of lost. So too much freedom can also be a bad thing.
So I want to close off this point by saying, look, as a leader, your job is to lead. So don't be afraid to take charge and lead, because too much freedom can create a lot of ambiguity. And as a leader, your job is to remove ambiguity, not to create more of it. So with that, let's move on to the next point.
The next one it's somewhat personal. This is the one thing that I wish I knew, was that you should thank your team members a lot. So when I was first getting started with my company, I thought that it was assumed that, if I hired you and you're on my team, then of course I love you, and of course I appreciate you, and of course I think that, you're a rock star. But I realized pretty quickly that none of that is assumed. It's not implied. You have to tell your employees and team members how much you appreciate them and thank them on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis. You want to really make them feel like they matter and that they're recognized. Because at the end of the day, all that matters is people want to feel like they're contributing to something and that their work is making a difference. They don't want to come into work and not know that and not have clarity around that. And in fact, there's even studies to show that, employee recognition actually makes a bigger difference in how happy and how productive they are, rather than just paying them money. So you can actually pay them a lot of money, but they won't necessarily be happy or be productive if they're not being recognized for their work.
And remember, you can't just thank them once and think you're done with it. You have to thank them over and over and over again. If anything, put it on your calendar if you have to. Don't forget to thank your team. So, with that, let's move on to one of the final points.
The next big lesson that I learned the hard way was that you should give more equity instead of more cash. So when I was first determining my first employee salaries, I kind of based them off the industry averages. So I went on Google, I went online, and I found out what the industry average salary is for X type of employee with this much of experience. And I gave them the equity and cash compensation based on the industry averages. But in hindsight, I think I should have done something differently where I give people a little less cash but a lot more equity. And the reason I say this is because when you give someone equity, they become an owner of the company, right? And so the more equity they have, the more they own the company. And so they start to think of the company from an owner perspective or from a founder perspective. And this completely changes how they think of their job. In fact, they don't even think of it as a job anymore, because instead of coming into work and just doing tasks to complete a job, they're coming into work thinking about how to actually create value for the company. Because they benefit from that, right? Because in the long run, if they create value, then they can capture some part of that value because they have equity in the company. So it completely changes how they think about their work, because they're thinking much more long term and much more about value creation rather than purely about getting stuff done or getting tasks completed. So in hindsight, especially for the first like 5 or 10 employees, I would have given a little bit less cash and a little bit more equity. And that's not to say that you don't pay them at all, because I don't believe in that. I don't believe in just paying people equity, because that's, people need to eat food and people need to survive. It's just that I would rebalance it a bit. And the other cool thing about doing this is that it self-selects for the right people. Because if a person is willing to sacrifice a little bit of cash to get a little bit more equity, then they're probably the right type of people who want to commit, time and hard work, and they're looking for the long-term potential of the company rather than just the short-term cash they can get for doing a job. So especially in the 5 or 10 employees that you hire, you want people who are willing to kind of commit for the long term rather than just thinking short term.
And plus, it's a win-win for both sides, because for the founder, what you want are people who have skin in the game so that they're motivated to create value for the company. But on the other end, if they do create value, what that skin in the game does is it gives them the ability to capture some of that value themselves, whereas cash is very short-term. So just think about this a little bit more next time you're hiring someone and next time you're thinking about how much to compensate them. So with that, let's move on to one of the final points. I know I said this last time, but I promise, I think we're almost at the end.
Okay, this one is, this is funny because I know a lot of engineer-minded people do this, is reinventing the wheel when you don't need to. So honestly, okay, a startup is all about, like I said before, running a bunch of experiments. And your only advantage compared to bigger companies who have way more resources than you is that you can run experiments really quickly. So you want to be putting out stuff really quickly, right? But if you're reinventing the wheel in places that you don't need to invent the wheel, then you're going to waste time. And so don't reinvent the wheel unless it's purely related to your core competence. For example, one mistake I made was when we were building our original website, I decided that we're going to build our website from scratch using React. In hindsight, we could have just used like a template off of Squarespace or Webflow and used those 1 or 2 weeks that we spent building the website instead building the app. The app is our core competence. The website is just a website. So, when it's not related to your core product or your core competence, don't reinvent the wheel, especially when it comes to engineering. I know a lot of engineering-minded people who want to reinvent the wheel. They want to build like cool things and they want to code cool things, but you're not going to survive if you spend time building cool things that don't really make an impact to the bottom line or to helping you succeed as a startup. So only reinvent the wheel when it really matters. And the worst thing that you can do especially is reinvent the wheel around internal tools. Luckily at True Story we were smart enough not to do that, but I've seen some companies where they will build their own like Jira or some kind of task management software or project management software. And there's so many off-the-shelf tools to do that you don't even have time, and it just doesn't make sense to go rebuild all those internal tools. The only thing that you want to be coding from scratch and doing from scratch is stuff that's related to your core competence. Everything else, outsource it.
And remember, folks, reusing stuff that other people have built so that you can move faster is not cheating. In fact, it's the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. So with that, let's finally move on to the last point. And I promise this is the last point I'm going to make today.
This final one hits home for me because it's the reason that we fundamentally shut down the company. And it's that you should validate the market in the early days. You can have the perfect product and you can have the perfect team and you can have the perfect execution, but if the market doesn't exist for the product you're building, then you will fail. And Mark Andreessen has said this many times over in his blog post, where he says that, even with the perfect team, the execution, the perfect product, if the market doesn't exist, that will fail. So there's no point in you spending your precious time building a product and building a team if the market doesn't end up existing. So I'd highly recommend that in the early days, in the first month, in the first 3 months, in the first 6 months, just spend a lot of your time validating the market. Because the biggest mistake entrepreneurs make is they build stuff that no one really wants. And if the market doesn't want it, you can't force the market to want it. Your company is going to die. And so really spend time in the early days to validate your market, because you can do everything else right, but if the market doesn't exist, you will not succeed.
Phew, I think we're finally done. And for those of you who actually stuck around till the very end, huge props to you, because this was a long video and I know I repeated some stuff, but hopefully this was helpful to you. So with that, I'll just close off and say one last thing and then we can say goodbye.
And the final point I want to make is that it doesn't matter how much you read or how much advice you listen to or how many business schools you go to or how many business degrees you get. None of that matters, because the only thing that's going to matter is you going out and building something, because that's the only way you're going to learn. I heard all of this advice and way more when I worked at Andreessen Horowitz, or when I read business books, or when I read blog posts, but none of it really truly stuck with me. I didn't really have context for what all that truly meant until I went out and built my own company. And then it all finally clicked. I was like, oh, okay, all of this makes so much sense now. And so you can sit here and listen to me, but you're not gonna learn until you go out and do it. So my biggest tip to you is go out and build your company, because we need more entrepreneurs who are out there running experiments. So stop listening to me and get out there and start building your company.
It's been a day, stressing out like crazy, just wanna be lazy with my girls. It's been a day.
Don't think I should record and drive. Alright, I'm at a red light, so I can finally record. Gosh, it was literally just raining cats and dogs, and now it's almost sunny outside. I don't understand New Jersey weather.
Yeah, we won't let them get away with